you and welcome to another lecture in our Fearless Female series. Lectures on powerful and influential or just interesting women of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And it's my pleasure to introduce Albrecht Classen, University Distinguished Professor of German Studies at the University of Arizona. He's past president of the Modern Language Association, the Rocky Mountain Modern Language Association. He's the recipient of the 2012 Outstanding Academic Title Award from Choice magazine for his Handbook of Medieval Studies. He's the editor of the journal Medievistik and the author or editor of an astonishing body of scholarship in medieval studies that few scholars in the world can rival now or have ever rivaled. His complete CV, his resume, is a staggering 382 pages long. And as of June 1st, 2014, that was the latest iteration of it. It's probably closer to 500 pages long by now. He had published 76 books, 569 articles, 2,161 book reviews in English and in German. His scholarship is perceptive, learned, meticulously detailed, influential, and obviously copious. His teaching is obviously influential as well. For instance, he's the only medievalist I know in the world who was the visiting football coach for a major university football team. This was in 2002. He was the guest coach for the Arizona Wildcats, and this testifies to his popularity among students, even large ones like him tremendously. His ability to convey his enthusiasm for and knowledge of the Middle Ages to undergraduates and graduates alike has earned him other distinctions, such as being named the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching Arizona Professor of the Year in 2012. That's for all of Arizona. And his receiving the American Association of Teachers of German Outstanding German Educator Award in 2006. He's been awarded an award for distinguished service to the University of Arizona. That was in 2008. And so in all areas of academic life, he has proved to be a stellar example for all of us to emulate and hate. You can't hate him for long. As you'll see, he's a truly engaging, witty scholar, and he's about to talk to us about women and the Reformation.
Thank you very much, Bob, for the very kind introduction. I'm a big flatterer, but you do a good job. Yeah. I'm very pleased that I have this opportunity to talk to you about a topic that I find extremely interesting. And I'm very sure you all will later agree with me, although at first sight it might be a little bit far-fetched. I think we'll all agree at the end, I hope, that these historical perspectives are really absolutely fundamental. And I like always to start with one simple metaphor that occurred to me recently to explain to you a little bit why we would need or would want to have the Middle Ages. That seems to be far away. Many people might say, oh, Dark Ages, primitive, whatever, and so forth and so forth. I have a very simple metaphor to explain everything to you in one image. If you are a good botanist, so you study, for example, trees, you will immediately understand what I'm saying. How does a tree grow? How does the water get from the roots to the very top? Because the roots are deep in the soil and they are the essentials. You might not see the roots, but without good roots, the Middle Ages, the future will not grow. Absolutely. The past contains our future. So if you want to understand, in a way, how we will develop into the future, you have to look backwards. So, and I will try to illustrate this with this talk about women, mostly of German origin, in the age of the Renaissance, but I don't want to start without expressing really great thanks to my friends and sort of the intellectual framework where I feel like we are a big family here in Arizona, the ACMRS, one of the flagships, I would dare say, of medieval early modern studies. And it's kind of always an amazing thing that's here in Arizona. Arizona is really just an incredible place. We're doing wonderful things. And also if you go to our libraries, both here at ASU or at U of A, we have phenomenal holdings of early modern books, even incunabula and even manuscripts. Many other places in the world would envy us if they knew. So we better keep it a secret. No. But it's wonderful to have all the support. I don't want to mention all the people at the center, but they're all wonderful and really stellar support. Without you all, we couldn't do this. So I really thank you all very much for coming. And let's now jump into the topic itself. You can see already that that I took over here the flyer. You have seen this. And there's one thing I would like to change of this poster, if I may, and I hope that you all will join me later. You see this lady at the right side, muted, and I would love to rip this tape off her mouth. And that's what I will do right now. So I hope you will do this with me. Let me first begin with some general question. Why would we want to study women or gender relationships in the past? And to stay within my analogy, if we want to understand our world today, let's say the way how men and women, or men and men, or women and women, whatever, correlate, it behooves us just to understand where we have come from, what are the timeless issues, and what are the differences. You know, we cannot simply say the Middle Ages were just like us. They were different, but the struggle of our predecessors reflects upon our future. Just like modern day feminists can no longer just simply move forward. They have always to look back. Where did the struggle start? And where are we today? And where will we be in the future? So that's the first point. I also would like to say that the study of women is not simply a fanciful, theory-driven approach just to find new territory for tenure-track professors to get tenure, not just to publish something, publish or perish, but it is one of the really exciting fields of research. Why? Medieval studies, they can date back at least to, let's say, roughly 70, 80, 70, 90, when it slowly picked up. And if you think about, let's say, Beowulf studies, or Chaucer studies, or Nibelungenlied studies, that goes back a long time. So there's lots of research. The libraries are just filled with this stuff. So for young people, for example, who start their career, it's very hard to find something really new, or something exciting. But turning to something inadequately called minority voices. Women were of course not minority, but they were treated like a minority, allows us to go back to the archives and to explore what the sources might have been and whether we might not be able to find, and we definitely do, many documents that speak about the situation women have gone through. And it also will hence allow us to do something, and I see some young members of in the audience, I'm very happy to see those. It allows us also to question what our standard textbooks and school books tell us and what they do not tell us. And I guarantee you, in most cases, our textbooks are wrong, are just plain wrong. That's what research really does, and we're always shocked about this when we go back to the schools. Oh my goodness, you're still in the 1880s. Could you not find it? I mean, anyway. So, you know, this is sort of the disconnect between research and public schools, but for that reason, I'm also very thankful for the center working in this regard to reach out to the schools, and that's what we also do right now, and so I'm very happy to have such a big audience. because you're the public. Thank you very much. So we could simply say that in many regards, women in the Middle Ages represented the alternative voices. To give you an analogy to modern day, we could say as much as today, for example, gay writers represent the alternative voices. So in medieval times, women represented the alternative voices. And it does behoove us really to consider simply statistics. We're talking about 50% of the population, always. We have never really had any major discrepancy between the genders. Even under the worst circumstances, nature always has sort of leveled out those conditions. So when we look at women's voices, we discover first of all that to some extent they're simply part of the same discourse. Women talked often more than men, but then the question comes, who has recorded their texts? So what we quickly realize immediately in this entire area of discussion, we're really talking about power. Who holds the power? Because, face it, the written word is power. So what we're doing is we try to understand how this power was managed, by whom, through what channels, and how we can retrieve the archives and thereby regain new insights. We also are then able to recognize a very complex situation. This is something what probably the public doesn't like about us researchers. You know, we are nasty people. We always say, wait a minute, it was a little bit different. It wasn't quite as you like it. We destroy the very homogeneous image. We always discover alternatives. But gender discourse, for example, was always messy. And that's just the way how it is. It makes it hard to enter then textbooks or school books, because the situation is difficult. And that's exactly what I would like to talk about. I could probably discuss this for many, many different hours, so I will focus just on one little area a little bit later. So that's the power structures, and at the same time, I also want to find the individual voice. I mean, within all the large discussions, the question still always remains, who is the individual? What individual emerged out of her conditions and was then finally able to express herself? What made that possible? And that's the universal question even today. For every individual, how do you reach that level so that you can express yourself and voice your opinion? How do you defend your opinion? That's one of the fundamental things I always try at least to teach my students. They have to argue, they have to learn how to argue, and that is a form of empowerment. So I often see myself and my role as a university teacher helping my students to get empowered. So that's the same thing, looking at the history of women, it's a form of empowerment, because the past comes back and we begin to realize we are connected. So I just skip a little bit. We know quite a lot more, at least, about women in the Middle Ages than we have traditionally thought. But this is not a really terribly new thing. This is something, this is the result of very intensive research, at least the last 60 or 70 years. But it's, oddly enough, not slowing down. It's like a volcano that begins to erupt further and further, and the more questions we come up with, the more insights we gain. And another really interesting thing is that in terms of women's history, we realize that we need to draw from every possible discipline there is. Let's say banking, medicine, music, architecture, literature, of course history all the time, religion, food preparation, trade, economics, politics, and so forth. So the entire diversity of human life in the past suddenly comes into focus. That makes it so hard for me really just to nail me down. But then there's always a danger that I will just extrapolate and go on and on and on. So you have to stop me at some point. The problem with professors is always once you give them the podium, they never leave. You know? So, be sure that you can stop me at some point. Skip over some of those things, but you can see what I mean when I look into the entire history of women. all these different aspects come into play. Very, very important. I hope, by the way, that this side can see more or less. If not, well, I'm not quite sure. I'm a little bit in your way, but okay, good, thank you. What I will do primarily here is look at the last 4 or 5 topics. So medicine, the arts, religion, literature, and then also political issues, all focusing on the early 16th century. That is sort of kind of a turning point, which makes it possible for me really to give you a quick and dense perspective, maybe. Just to give you here an indication how much is happening right now in research. I'm not quite sure whether you can find this book here in this bookstore, but it was just published last year, the Oxford Handbook of Women and Gender in Medieval Europe. It's a heavy, thick book, a reference work, which contains thousands of references, so to just give you an idea how much research is going on. So it's almost endless, but a really exciting topic. As a preparation for the actual topic, I like to refer to a field we call mysticism. This is a topic just by itself, but I need to touch it quickly because it spilled then later over to the 16th century. Mysticism is a form of religious experience when the individual, fully awake, not asleep, not drugged, fully awake, has an experience of the Godhead, whatever it might be, and subsequently, after this out-of-body experience, they start writing down. And I've listed here a very short list. It might seem a long list, but it's a very, very short list of the virtually hundreds of women throughout the later Middle Ages, including the early modern age, who had, or they were privileged to have these experiences, which in most cases empowered them tremendously. Empowered them tremendously to the point that they had more authority than the priests or even the bishops, because God had spoken directly to them and people believed them. Okay, that's always a matter of very personal belief, but this is just a list of extremely important women, such as Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century, Julian of Norwich, late 14th, early 15th century, and virtually all over Europe, and including even Peru and Mexico. So that continues well into the New World. So in those areas, women had a tremendous opportunity to express themselves, and they were then able to write. And this religious component, that is sort of then the common denominator, as we'll see it later also in the 16th century. The religious experience might be a little bit strange for us in our very secular world, but this religious experience became the fulcrum upon which this new power relationship pivoted. And so we'll see how these personal quests for religious illustration and illumination in the 16th century led to a major sort of paradigm shift. I would like to alert you to a community of women whom we call beguines. Has anyone heard of beguines before? Beguines were sort of women, we would call them today, or their houses, their beguine hofs, we would call them sort of women houses. Sort of houses for women who searched or looked for refuge from society. They didn't want to join a monastery, they just wanted to live their own life, a devout, a pious life, and then they started creating female communities. This is the site in Bruges, or Brugge, that's in Belgium. There are many, many places like this all over Belgium, Holland, northwestern Germany, even to some extent southern Germany, Switzerland, and even maybe a little bit Austria. And these are very beautiful, very tranquil places where women could withdraw and live their own life and lead their own life even in economic terms. The church often didn't quite like them. There was often the accusation, you just hide your brothels. You just do nasty stuff there. Women alone, never trust a woman. So but these were always very devout women, and they could establish themselves, as I said, mostly all over northwestern Europe, and began to give women a voice. And this was then sort of the launching pad for many other developments we'll see a little bit later. And I would have a challenge for you. I wanted just to give you quickly a rundown, but I'd rather just challenge you. Could you come up with the name of any female writer in the 15th century? Do you think there was someone like Chaucer? I mean, a female Chaucer? I've never heard of one. However, we have her. We have her. We have Eleanor von Österreich, Christine Pisan, Leonora da Cordova, Helene Kottanere. So, Marjorie Kemp, England. Elizabeth von Nassau-Saarbrücken, French princess, lived in Germany. Eleonora von Österreich, Austria. Christine Pisan, France. Leonora da Cordova, Spain. Helene Kottanere, Hungary. All over Europe. And recent research has revealed that indeed, when we rewrite the annals of literary history, we suddenly discover a huge slew of very powerful women writers. So, for example, the second writer, she wrote 4 novels. Her last 2 novels have appeared in modern prints just this year. The iceberg, if I may say so, I know it's inappropriate for Arizona, but the iceberg of women's literature is surfacing only now, if you will, and is rising further and further. So I want to lead you from here then to the next centuries and just sort of drop a couple of names to give you a further sense of the enormous spread of highly learned women. Of course, we know only of the learned women. We do not know much about peasant women. We do not know much about, let's say, urban women. But even there, we make progress. But here we have a very famous, highly learned Italian woman, Laura Ceretta. Then we have, during the Protestant Reformation, a very new development where a number of women came to the fore. Those are the women I would like to talk about, but quickly as a background, are you all familiar with this revolution called the Protestant Reformation? You know, Martin Luther coming forth and saying, I want to reform the church. The church says, no, we're going to burn you. Well, and he said, well, then to hell with you! Sorry. And so he created his own church, and what he did was he discovered there was a power vacuum. The Catholic Church had lost to a large extent. It was very boring for people. They disliked the clergy in general. There was massive accusation of adultery and sexual abuse. They used all kinds of financial dealings. I'm talking about the Catholic Church at that time. So the Protestants came into this power vacuum and started this entire Protestant Reformation or movement. To some extent created almost a collapse of the Catholic Church, but that then later changed about 1540, 1550, when the Catholic Church sort of came back, but on a very different premise. So we have, for a short time, a very invigorating new time. I call it really a revolution, not just a reform. It was a revolution because the entire concept at that time, the way how people saw the world, how they understood their world, changed. And one of the most radical things came from the most boring things there might be in the world, namely from translation. Just translation. Translators, believe it or not, translators change the world. Their names often remain hidden or forgotten. But translators are those who transfer knowledge from one area, or from one language area to another, which can then revolutionize the world. The written world coming into a new territory, and suddenly people say, oh, wait a minute. And then revolution started. But, and I could really give a long lecture about the Reformation. You all would fall asleep. I cannot risk that. So, but just a few images. What is striking about these three images? Martin Luther, some of the princes, there's me, no, not me. It's been lunchtime, and so forth. There are images, also modern images of the Protestant Reformation. What do you notice? What strikes you? Amen, exactly. That's sort of the idea we are normally told. All these major political events were determined 100% just by men. To a large extent, that was unfortunately probably also true. However, I will try to show you how much other forces were at play as well. So, for example, there is, and here really begins sort of the juice of my talk, there's Katharina von Bora. Katharina von, or of Bora, looks like a very attractive, energetic woman. She married Martin Luther, or Luther as we should really say, and without her, I think the Protestant Reformation would have failed, because she was the one who ran Luther's household. She was the one who managed all the dinners, hosting 50 to 60 students every day, guests from all over the world. She was the one who had the budget under control. She made sure that her husband got decent food and took care of himself. And so we have a woman sort of in the background. We don't have really writings from her. I will give you other writings from other women soon. But it's a very clear, a very important example. If you will, you could say she was like Barbara Bush, if you remember her. You know, sometimes you really need a woman behind a man. Without that, they are failing. And that was very much the case with Martin Luther. But anyway, that's the beginning. And then I want to talk for a while about probably the most interesting woman. I have just a few images, and I do not have much text available, at least not in English translation, and not with me, but there are possibilities for you to read some of her text. Argula von Grumbach, an odd name, right? Very, very strange. I remember when I was first asked to write a little article about it, it was for a dictionary of medieval women writers, and I had done a whole bunch of little entries until then I was finally asked, oh, could you not write about this Argula von Grumbach or something like that? And I said, well, I can try, and you might have noticed I pronounced the name very differently. So no one, that was in the mid-80s, late 80s, and no one knew this name. And they misspelled the name. So only after intensive research did I finally find out, oh, this woman spells her name like this. And then I had to go to the archive. So I went to the archives. I went then to Germany and searched, and I discovered a really interesting, feisty woman. So she is sort of the icon of my entire talk here tonight. And this is a little bit blurry, but this image, it's a wood print from 1523, right? You can see the date there, 1500 XX111. Okay, that's 1523. It's a very sort of the beginning of this major revolution or reform. So, Albrecht von Grumbach used what we normally call sort of a power vacuum. You know, the Catholic Church had lost great influence. The Protestants were not quite there yet. They were only slowly developing their own church. So everything was in flux at that time. So in those early years, 1521, 22, 23, 24, by 1526, 27, it changed. And this image then is the cover for one of her texts. So this woman, Argula von Grumbach, wrote a couple of texts for very specific reasons. So she comes from a place or an area called Bavaria, and there is a town called Ingolstadt. Anyone drives an Audi? No one drives an Audi? Well, then you would know where Ingolstadt is located. That's where these cars are built, at least the German brand. And Ingolstadt later also became, you could say, the foundation for Arizona. This is now an odd thing, but Ingolstadt was always the university for the Jesuits. And all of Arizona was basically established, formed, and developed by Jesuit missionaries. All of them basically came from Ingolstadt in one way or the other. But that's just a little bit before that. And in Ingolstadt was a student. Always beware these evil students. So, and this young man, Seehofer, had heard about Martin Luther, and he tried to do the same thing. So he posted some flyers. He tried to do a campaign. You know, he didn't have Facebook yet, so things would have been much easier for him. He was like the students in Hong Kong right now, if you think like that, right? So they apprehended him. Of course, the Catholic Church always likes to do that, and their favorite method was off to the stake. Let's burn him. That's what the good method. She heard about this, and indeed then decided to rally to his support, help him, and indeed she started writing. She started writing to the university. She wrote to the Princess of Bavaria. She wrote to the magistrates of Ingolstadt. She wrote to Martin Luther, and her texts were very quickly published all over Germany, at least. And this woodcut gives us an incredibly good illustration of the power structure, the new power structures that were at play at that time. What do you see in that image? Help me. So you see a woman, right, all by herself. What does she hold? A book. These men, there's a whole group of men. Are they well dressed? I'm not quite as well dressed as them, but anyway, you can see authority. Okay, these are all authority figures. So they obviously belong either to the church or to the university. And they rely on their authority by way of what? Holy Scripture. Where is the Holy Scripture? On the ground. They don't even read the text anymore. They just rely on tradition. And she holds a German Bible. It's not the modern translation by Martin Luther yet. And she says, let me hold your feet to the fire. What does the holy text really say? Let me interpret for you. Mind you, she had no PhD. And she goes to the university and tells and challenges all professors and says, you ignoramuses, you know nothing. I hold the Bible, I can read, and I know better than you. So we have here an incredible case of a woman whose texts were then extremely popular for some time. Very easy to read, right? It is. Dem durchleuchtigsten, hochgeborenen Fürsten, Herrn, Herrn, Friedrich, Herzog, and so forth. So you can, well, sorry. For me, that's very, very easy to read. If you ever try to read the handwritings by Martin Luther, I would despair. That's nicely printed, very clear, and you can see here's her name, Argula Stauferin. Okay, so you have suddenly in this political, religious vacuum a woman who realizes that she has the potential. We know that she had received the Bible from her father. She had studied the Bible for a long time. She knew the Bible sort of in and out. And at that critical moment when she wanted to protect this young man, she used her opportunity and she started what we would call today a media campaign. And in this media campaign, she realized she only just had to use the book. And we are now, right now, in the 20s and the 30s, sort of the time when Microsoft is taking off. The printing press. You get the idea, right? I'm just drawing this analogy. The invention of the printing press was as revolutionary as the discovery and invention of the computer. But you remember also the computer had to take about 20 years to reach maturity. And that's the same thing with the printing press. So by 1500, 1510, 1520, the book markets just exploded, and she got into this window and could publish a whole bunch of treatises or letters in which she explained her position, which she defended herself, argued about theological points, argued in defense of Martin Luther, and tried to introduce the Protestant Reformation in her lands. Her texts were extremely popular because no one before had heard of a woman who was so energetic and so engaged in defending theological points. It was, however, also a power vacuum. Patriarchy kind of had dwindled away for a couple of years, because as soon as the Protestant Church emerged, meaning that the Protestant clergy came forward, they very quickly made sure that her texts disappeared. After 1524, no more texts by her. We have one or two traces of more texts, 1529, 1530, and then all traces of this woman just disappear. In this regard, the poster is completely correct, just the reverse order. She was muted once again. She was too revolutionary. I would like to say, let me go back. She was too powerful. She knew too well how to utilize the texts, the authoritative texts, to her advantage. And so that's one thing I always like to tell my students, at least. I warn them, and I say, look, we are working toward the goal of making you really completely literate and able to interpret things. I know I'm a revolutionary, so don't tell NSA, they will not like that. But reading, the power of reading, the power of interpreting texts, that is revolutionary. It gives you power. And her ability is then of reading and arguing about it. That is the most amazing thing. There's no difference between her, let's say, and Julia Kristeva or Virginia Woolf in the late 19th and 20th century. Except that this whole movement then kind of was repressed. So that's one point. And just using the same image, we could go from here and explore many other voices. One of the problems, however, and I'm going to do this, is that most of their texts are still in the archives and not printed. We have no direct access, not even talking about translations. Many, many texts are still waiting for the discovery. The iceberg really is not even halfway out of the water. So there are many doctoral dissertations waiting for the future. So please, help me. We need your help in the future. For example, this woman, she was wife of a major minister down in Strasbourg, which is between France and Germany, Katharina von Zell. Her texts are not out there yet. I discovered her in the archives. I don't have any text edition of her either. Then this woman, I think I'm the only one in the world who knows about her, but I have microfiche of her texts. That's already archaic. Yeah, I got it in the mid-90s. At that time, they didn't have digital copies. So I'm working with a group in Utah where they're building a website where they try to download and store all texts by women writers from whatever, Middle Ages and Renaissance. So something is happening, but we need to rush because the technology is disappearing. Microfilms, microfiche. Oh my God, that is medieval. No, wait. I'm getting ahead of myself, right? So there are many other, and there, this woman, for example, I discovered some of her texts. Again, the literary histories are so wrong. I mean, I love this bookstore, but lots of these books here are wrong. I'm sorry, don't get me wrong, I don't want to criticize anything, but our literary histories are still wrong. And so there's lots of stuff waiting for us to be discovered, both in the Middle Ages, and I'm very much working in that area, as well as in the 3rd and 16th century. Quickly, another example. We know just a little bit more about her. She was an Italian. She married a German medical doctor in about 1520, moved to Germany, and became the first Greek teacher. She taught Greek, for heaven's sake. She was one of the few Greek teachers in Europe at that time, like Erasmus of Rotterdam. I mean, a major figure, but we don't know much about her. And let me turn to Anna Ovena Hoyers, just another remarkable figure. Can I see hands? Anyone has heard of her? Oh, right, yeah, of course, yes. Where I talked before. And it's another clear indication. What do the literary historians do to us? Well, they replicate, duplicate, and do maybe digest, but they do not necessarily pay respect or attention to new knowledge. So that's something that will change all our literary histories in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So research is such an exciting field, really. It's like discovering new galaxies in a way. So why am I talking about her? She lived in the late 16th and early 17th century. She was, for a long time, a very ordinary housewife. Happily married in northwestern Germany, not too far away from Bremen. Very, very rich woman through inheritance, but her husband basically squandered it all away, and then he died in about 1575 or so. And at that time, well, she was then a widow and looked for a new place for her own identity, and found it in a group of particularly devotional, pious people. And she realized suddenly, for her own sake, that the entire clergy in her area were just nincompoops and drug-addicted, adulterers and rapists and ignorant and so forth. I'm facetious, of course, but in her own terms, she used really virtually such words and terms and started attacking everyone within the church. And we have extensive texts from, oh, let's go fast. We have extensive texts from her. However, also very, very interesting. Ultimately, she had to flee. She was sort of pushed into exile. She went then to Sweden, and now we're really moving to the 17th century, so in the 1640s, when she lived in Stockholm, and well, just living a very miserable existence, until finally the Swedish queen came back from the 30 Years' War and heard about her, and finally some money got to her, and she could then finally turn to publishing, and she published then, but where? A huge body of very religious poetry at a very interesting place. Probably at the most liberal place of all of Europe since the 16th century. What do you think? Where would most Jews have found a way to publish things? Where did women find ways of publishing their works? In the town of Amsterdam. Yeah, good. You know about it, you have heard about it, and that is exactly the same situation with her. In Amsterdam, liberals could publish. They found ways, and by the way, that is still the case until today. Yeah, so the Dutch publishers are some of the most liberal and most open to alternative voices. I just leave her a little bit, sort of just as a teaser. Keep in mind, we have lots of these writers. I just would like to introduce a couple of more of them, such as Anna Maria van Schuurman. Now I have a Dutch woman. A very interesting case. She was extremely learned. Now we're talking about the early 17th century. She was so learned that she knew many different Asian languages. So definitely Aramaic, she knew of course Greek and Hebrew, she knew then some version of Arabic, Chaldean, and so forth. And she was highly praised all over Europe for her learning. I mean, at least as a learned woman, she was fine, okay, until later in her life she decided to do the same thing what many of her other sisters had done previously. Remember I talked about the beguines, those women who had withdrawn into their own women houses, and there was a movement, the Labadists, following sort of a spiritual leader, Labard, and they withdrew into, I would say today, like socialist communities. Really clearly a socialist community with shared property in the northern part of Frisia, so on the coast somewhere. And as soon as she had found her own way, the entire European scholarship dropped her like a hot potato. They didn't want that. They were willing, at least to some extent, to acknowledge that learning, but as soon as someone turned to an alternative lifestyle, she was a persona non grata. So altogether, I'm coming here to my conclusion, because I also would like to give you a little bit of a chance to talk with me about it or raise some questions. While actually looking over my slide sheet, I have actually much more. So I better come to an end so that we have a little bit of a discussion. But in a way, as a summary, and I will just fill in a little bit more. But the Protestant Reformation was, at least to some extent, sort of giving a window to women at that time to participate in a discourse that was really empowering women. Whoever had access to the Bible was certainly entitled to speak up in public. It caused huge problems very soon. There were lots of very bitter fights, internecine strife, if you will, amongst the Protestant groups. But the women, there were a whole bunch of women all over, at least Germany, Switzerland, Austria, but then later also to some extent in Italy and in Holland and in northern France, who were then able to use that opportunity to express themselves. So we will have to change our literary histories in the future. I skipped over this a little bit. I want to give you a few more examples to support my general claim, but from a different angle. What is my claim? My claim is that, contrary to our general assumption, there were many different opportunities for women already in the Middle Ages, and particularly in the Protestant Reformation, to come to the fore and to express themselves in many different forms. And I would like to introduce to you probably one of the greatest gems unknown to the public of a 16th century, actually already much earlier, monastery, women's convent, if you will. It's called Wienhausen. I would bet $1,000 you have never heard of Wienhausen. But you might want to come with me and visit it. It is sort of the Sistine Chapel north of the Alps. Not in the Renaissance style, still very much medieval, late medieval. And what we have here, I will come back to that just in a minute, is something like that. It is a monastery in which we have a fairly large room. We call it the nuns' choir. And the nuns had something we call in Latin horror vacui, so the horror, the fear of any empty space. So they painted every spot in that room just to express their devotion and piety. And it is a really absolutely stunning room. To be able to see this, at least you're completely speechless. But why am I showing you this? I have lots of other things to show you from this monastery, but it all will hopefully support what I have to say. A little bit blurry, but these women were also, mind you, 14th, 15th, and then 16th centuries, so it's a continuous existence. these women were heavily involved in creating all kinds of artwork. They are particularly famous for their tapestries. This is the so-called Tristan tapestry. Some of you might have heard of Tristan, the Tristan material, Eilheid, or Beruhl, or Gottfried von Straßburg, the most pan-European love story of Tristan and Isolde. And these nuns created a tapestry that is about the size of the entire wall, like this, up to about here. They show it only once a year. So you have to go there around the time of Pentecost. So there are about 15 of these huge tapestry hanging in that room. When I did research in that monastery, the librarian gave me a key and I could go in. Oh my God! I tell you, it doesn't happen. I'm completely alone. He left me there for about 15 minutes. Oh my God! But what does this tapestry tell us? What is the connection between this tapestry and Argula von Grumbach and her writings, her letters, or then much later, Ovena Hoyers, or Schurmann, and many of these other writers, or Laura Cereta? These are different manifestations of what women did, could do, were entitled to do, particularly when they found the political framework. And a monastery has always been, and that's really a phenomenon throughout the entire Middle Ages, monasteries have always been major sites of art production. So the irony of the Protestant Reformation was that they said, well, there's no word about monasteries in the Bible. There's no word. There are no monks, no nuns, no abbots, nothing. So let's close them. That meant the end of women's freedom, in a way, in a very ironic fashion. Now with Wienhausen, there are about 6 other monasteries in that area. That's the area, I should have a map, but that's the area of, in the vicinity of Brunswick, if you know where the VWs are built. Okay, well, sorry, I'm not making any money through this advertisement. But in that area, we have about 6 of different, these very odd monasteries. They exist until today. But a monastery is a very Catholic thing, right? So those women wanted to keep their monasteries. So in the 1530s, the local duke said, hey, guys, I am Protestant, and you get out of those places. And they said, no, we're staying. So finally, the duke sent his troops. They started tearing down the walls, and they said, oh, okay. But so they reached a compromise, and so they exist until today, and they constitute something that is an absolute oxymoron. They are Protestant monasteries. Huh? Wait a minute. Either monastery, then you're Catholic, or there's no monastery. They are sort of do just the opposite. So they're Protestants, but they're like a monastery. So you can visit them until today. Women really enjoy those places very much. Mostly widows join those monasteries. They find these places very welcoming, great opportunities to become, let's say, architects, weavers, artists, composers, mathematicians, whatever have you. Now, however, these are now medieval examples, and in these late medieval examples, they simply build a bridge between what I've told you about women in the Middle Ages, and then we move over to the Protestant age, where suddenly, as soon as there was an opportunity, of course, female writers came to the fore and tried to make their voices heard. And this then is basically the tenor throughout the ages, and we could really then go easily to the 6th, 17th, and 18th centuries. I just ran through this quickly. This is an interesting case. I was asked to write an article about this woman, and I realized that there is no research. No one knows about her. So finally, I found an edition from 1905. This one book in North America. One copy of her text. Well, then I told my library, hey, make photocopies. And later said, no, we don't need it. It's already digitized. Ah, so you can simply go online and find her text. But nevertheless, no one knows about her yet. So that's very interesting, very passionate, very religious, very much sort of Jesus-oriented devotional poetry, but quite significant poet of her time. Or this Baroque writer, Katharina Regina von Greifenberg, very, very mystical, very esoteric, powerful poetry, sometimes hard to understand, but one of the best poets of her time. And then we can really come to our results. As results, we can say that we do have, of course, whenever we turn our attention, it's just our decision. Keep that in mind. We decide what we want to do. And if and once we decide that this is a topic of relevance, whether we are in the 9th century, or whether we're in the 16th century, or in the 18th century, it's the same result. We find female power. Absolutely, of course. We find individuals who are able to express themselves, who could produce art, who were able to participate in the public political discourse, even if it pertained only to church issues. We find lots of women who had incredible poetic skills. We rediscover them right now, today. We also observe that many of these women were empowered through religious vision. So next time you find a person you think he or she is a little bit odd, wait. That might be a catapult for a lot of power. And they were, in other words, also then spokespersons of their own time. We have ignored them for too long. Well, but it's better right now. Research has already remedied the situation to some extent, but that's until, well, now still very much just research. We need to reach out, and so I'm very happy that you could participate tonight a little bit, and I just leave this aside, and thank you all very much for coming. I hope we can have a little bit of a discussion. Thank you so much.